But for the midterm exam, you have this PowerPoint presentation that is in the learning module section in Blackboard. Use this PowerPoint for your study material. You can take notes and do things like that if you want to, but if it's not in this PowerPoint, it's not on the exam. It's pretty straightforward. In this midterm, one of the things that I did is I organized it by topic, so it's not by chapter. It's not progressively as we work through it. It's organized by the topic together. So if you have a question that's based on a topic, you can easily figure it out in the PowerPoint where it would be located. Anything that's in the PowerPoint is fair game for the exam. Look specifically for bold, underlined, or italicized comments. Those are going to indicate some kind of importance or instruction as to what I want you to do. That goes for not only the PowerPoint presentation, but also for the midterm exam itself. So I will bold, underline, italicize to try to draw attention as to what I'm looking for in that answer. The format for the midterm, it's only 20 questions. You have 1 hour to complete it. It will auto submit whatever you've answered if you run out of time. Once you start it, you have to submit the exam. The questions will only be presented one at a time. And then once you've answered them, you cannot return back to that question. So that's part of it only being 20 questions is you can't bounce back and forth to the questions. You answer one at a time. Once it's answered, you don't go back. Anybody have any questions on that part? All right. The types of questions that are on there, I'm going to specifically state when I ask the question as to what I'm looking for. So particularly on the fill in the blanks, I'm going to give you the format that I request that you submit that. If it's answered in any other format than what's requested, there's no partial points on the fill in the blank. You'll also have multiple choice, multiple answer. On the multiple answer, you'll get partial points. There's true and false, and then there's matching. And on the matching, you'll get partial points. I do want to say on your grade, when you submit this score, that is not your final grade, meaning that I have to hand grade every single midterm that's in there. The Blackboard system will grade it according to the way that it has it set up for grading, but it's not your final grade. I have to hand grade these exams. So if you get a grade that you feel is fairly low, just wait, let me grade the exam, then we can go back and talk about it during your meetings. Anybody have any questions on the midterm in terms of format? Okay, pay attention to spelling. If, for example, there's two ways to spell a given color, make sure that you give me the one that was on the screen when you originally proposed it. For example, the color gray, G-R-E-Y or G-R-A-Y. It doesn't really matter, but if I give you the variable G-R-E-Y, you should answer with G-R-E-Y, right? It's Python. Two different variable names. You got to give me the one that's in there. Capitalization matters. All of that kind of stuff matters on this midterm. It's Python. The other part of that is if it's Pythonic, meaning that however you answered that, if it actually gets the job done, but still fits the description that's in there, but isn't the answer that I assumed it would be, I will still count it. So for example, comma separated values. If you give it to me with spacing inside of there, technically that's still allowed by Python. So I will go ahead and accept that answer, but I have to hand grade that. In other words, Blackboard is looking for it to be comma separated with no spacing in it or vice versa. I have to go hand grade that. Anybody have any questions on that? This is a thing that gets brought up every semester. I've cleaned it up quite a bit to make sure that it's not as big of an issue as it used to be, but don't freak out if you get a score that's lower than you think it is. I still have to hand grade those assignments. All right, so getting into the topics themselves, clear back in the beginning, we talked about expressions being the most basic kind of programming instruction. An expression is always going to consist of values and some operator. So for example, 2 plus 2, the 2 is a value, the plus is an operator, and 2 is a value. Those will always evaluate or reduce down to a single value. And that single value with no operators is considered the expression itself, evaluating only to itself. A condition itself is an expression. Just be more specific to flow control statements. And when an expression evaluates to a Boolean value of true or false. So when we use it as a condition, for example, say in an if loop, or in an if statement, then we are evaluating down to true or false. All right, variables. We talked about these a couple times. Variables, obviously, are stored. They store a value of some data type. Assignment statements, we use a single equal sign in order to use the assignment operator. For example, spam equals 42. Spam is assigned the integer value of 42, and spam can be used in code, the word spam, because that's our variable name from there on out. Remember that variable names are case sensitive, so all of these are different, and that variable names should have a meaningful, should be meaningful to the value itself. So in other words, don't call it something that doesn't make any sense, because as you get through your code, it's going to be a lot harder to follow if you do that. For example, calling it var1 is not going to be as beneficial as calling it name or whatever. Variables can be defined as global or local variables. Make sure you follow along with that. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. Naming conventions on variables. This will also be important in your midterm projects. You have to make sure that they're only one word. You can use camel case, for example, current balance here. The B can be capitalized. Do not start a variable name with a capital letter. It will accept it, but that's going to conflict with classes later on. So if I find that in like your midterm projects, I'll dock you on that, making sure that you don't start variable names with a capital letter. Okay. You can only use letters, numbers, and the underscore character, and it cannot begin with a number. So just once again, review this table so you make sure your variable names match what's valid and what's invalid. All right. Anybody got any questions on that stuff so far? Okay. We covered a lot of data types in this class. A data type is just a category for the value that's coming in. Every value belongs to exactly one data type. We have immutable and mutable. Remember that mutable data types have values that can be added, removed, or changed. Immutable means that we cannot change those type of data types. So when we look at a data type table here, the first three that we learned were integer, floating point, and string. Those are all immutable, meaning that we can't necessarily change those. We can reassign them, but we can't change them. And these are examples of what those data types look like. Remember, the big difference between a floating point and an integer is that we have a decimal point, but it is a negative 1.0 is different than a negative 1. One's an integer, one's a floating point. Remember that strings can also be numbers as well, but they are encompassed in these two quote marks or double quote marks, depending on what you put it in. We then talked about Boolean, which is either true or false. None type, which only has a value of none. A list is mutable, meaning that we can modify it. In a list, you can have any kind of data type inside the list. Remember that lists are ordered. We talked about tuples. Tuples are immutable versions of lists. And so they look exactly like a list. They function like a list, but you just can't modify them. We talked about dictionaries. And then what goes along with dictionaries are the dict keys, which looks a lot like a list, but it doesn't have the full behavior of a list. Dict values, which also looks like a list, and dict items, in which you get tuples back inside of a list. And a lot of you guys worked with these in the last homework assignment. All right, Boolean values, true, false, they must be capitalized, and they can be assigned to any variable. They're the result of some expression. Non-types, again, just the one value of none. They must be capitalized. In other words, that N has to be capitalized. The value without a value can be helpful if you need to store something that won't be confused for a real variable or real value in a variable. A non-value is returned from functions that do not have a return statement defined. So if you don't set up a return inside of a function, it's going to return nothing at that point, but it still returns a non-value by default. I'll pause there. Does anybody have any questions with those data types that we've covered so far? And please ask questions if you have questions, because I guarantee somebody out of the 75 students taking this class right now has the same question. All right, strings. Remember that these are considered the most universal data type because you can always convert integers and floats to strings, but you cannot always convert strings to integers or floats. You want to surround your string with either a single quote or a double quote. For example, this hello that you see here. You can create a blank string by saying something like spam equals and then the two quotes. We have string concatenation, in which we use the plus operator that will join strings or variables together. We use string replication, in which case we use the asterisk operator, and then we will repeat that number of strings. Remember that strings are immutable. String concatenation, it's been a while since we've done it, but you guys are being pretty good at it at this point, is when you add two strings together. For example, if we have Alice plus Bob, we're going to get Alice Bob. Notice that there's no space here because we didn't put a space inside these quotes. We can also join a string and a variable. So say we had a string like this, hello, we can also say spam plus world, and we will end up with hello space world. Notice that we left a space in the front here in order to do that. We cannot mix data types, though, by using string concatenation. So in other words, if we try to do string concatenation here by adding 5 to it, it's not going to work. On string replication, this is where we're going to repeat the string, which is just a multiply of whatever integer we give it. So if we have Alice asterisk 5, I don't want to say times because it's not times. I don't want people getting that confused with a math operator. Then you will get Alice, 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 Alice 5 times total. You cannot mix data types. So in other words, I can't do a string replication of one string by another string, and I cannot do it by integer or floating points either. All right, remember that strings are immutable, but you can mutate a string by using a combination of slicing and concatenation in order to build a new string by copying parts from the old string. So what does that mean? In this example, we have name equals Zofia cat. We can have new name, everything from 0 to 7, which means we're going to strip off this first 7 characters. Then we're going to add the word the in there, and then we're going to take the last 8 on characters or the last 8 index of everything else that's left. And that will change name from Zofia cat with the new name being Zophie the cat. Does everybody see how we kind of modified that with a new string? Again, we can't change the string itself, but we can create a new string by doing a combination of slicing. All right, double quotes. Remember, you can use single quotes or double quotes. Double quotes are handy when you have an apostrophe or a contraction inside the actual string. So for example, if we have that is Alice's cat, this will end up failing because we used single quotes here where you also have an apostrophe for the concatenation, where if we use double quotes, we'll be fine. Escape characters. These are going to allow you to put what otherwise characters would be impossible inside of a string. Remember that a slash single quote will escape that single quote. Double quote, a slash T is a tab, a slash N is a new line or a break, and double slashes is going to escape a slash if you need a slash inside of your string for whatever reason. You can use multi-line strings, in which case you will escape the slash N character when put into a new line string. And so it's often easier to read multi-line strings. For example, if we have print and then we have this long multi-line string, which is done by triple single quotes, then it will actually print with this spacing exactly the way that we had it set up here. There was a lot of methods associated with strings. So for example, we have dot upper, which will allow us to return a new string with all the letters converted to uppercase. Any non-letter characters in the string will remain unchanged. In other words, if there's letters or numbers in there, it'll be numbers. And it's useful for making case-insensitive comparisons. For example, we have somebody type in their name. If we want to do a comparison, instead of trying to write out 4 different, cases of capital J for Jason, lowercase j for Jason, or maybe the SON is capitalized for whatever reason, we just convert the whole thing to uppercase and just do one test. Same thing with lower, only it's going to convert it to lowercase. If we need to do tests against strings, we can use is upper in order to figure out whether it returns a Boolean true. in which case the first letter, or at least one letter, all the letters are uppercase. Is lower is going to check to see at least one letter, or all letters are lowercase. Is alpha is going to make sure that we only use letters and it's not blank. And is alpha num or al num is going to make sure that we have just letters and numbers, and no blank space. Is decimal is going to have us check whether or not it's numeric characters. This is beneficial in finding out whether or not they typed in something that was just numbers. In the past, we had to try to convert that over to an integer inside of a try and except so that we didn't error out. Is space is going to allow us to check to see if that string is just spaces or tabs or new line characters. And this last one is important, is title. That's going to make sure that it starts with an uppercase followed by lower cases. Is title should be used for all names inside of your programs. We also have starts with, if we want to check to see if a string starts with a given segment. We have ends with, in which we can check to make sure it ends with something. We can use .join, in which case we're going to pass in a list of strings and it creates a new string by iterating through the list of strings. So it's like doing a for loop and then adding it all to one string. Join does that for us. Split does the opposite. We take a whole string, we pass it some kind of separator, and it will split that string into multiple chunks. When it splits it out, it's going to return a list. So we have a list then that is separated on that. A common use of split is to split a multi-line string along the new line characters of the /n. So if you have a multi-line character, we can actually split it out into a list, which we could then use for a for loop if we wanted to slow it down and say print it out real slowly or something. We talked about justification. So we have rjust. Remember, with rjust and ljust and center, you have to pass a width and you have to pass a fill character. So by default, it's going to do it with spacing, right? If we wanted to fill in with, say, asterisks or pound signs or something else, we have to put that fill character in over there. Note that the width is going to take the entire width of the output, say it's 20. And if our word actually has 5 characters, how many are we going to have on the left? How many are we going to have on the right? Does anybody remember that? Say it's center. It's center. The word that we have is 5 characters. We put a width of 20 in. How many spaces on the left? How many spaces on the right? What's that? Yeah, it could be 8 or 7, right? The idea being that you have to have a weird number because you have a total of 20 with 5 out of there leaves you an odd number, which means 8 on the left or 7 on the right. Or it could be vice versa, depending on how Python takes it. So if you do the reverse of these, like we talked about, if you get a string that has a bunch of spaces in it and then a word, you would want to count all those spaces, the entire character length, that becomes your width. And then whatever fill character they use, that's what you would put in there. Right just adds things to the left. L just adds space to the right. This one's important. It's one that trips a lot of people up on the exam. Anybody have any questions over the justification stuff? All right, we have the strip functions, or strip methods, I should say. The strip methods are going to allow us to strip based on whatever character we pass it. So by default, it's going to strip any white space. Strip is going to strip any white space from the front and from the back of whatever character we pass it. L strip is going to strip everything leading up to it, and R strip is going to take off any of the white space at the end. It's essentially the opposite of justification. We're actually stripping those characters off. All right, so as examples of the stuff that we just talked about, if spam equals hello world, we say spam equals spam.upper. We're now going to get alt uppercase here. If we say spam is now spam.lower, it's going to convert the whole thing to lowercase. Anybody have any questions over strings? Anybody online have any questions? Okay. The next one we talked about was tuples. Tuples is going to be a data type that has multiple values inside of it. They are an ordered sequence. Tuples are used using parentheses. Tuples are immutable, meaning that values cannot be modified, appended, or removed. They are very similar to a list data type. So for example, if we have spam equals parenthesis hello 42 1.5, spam is now going to be this given tuple. That tuple is usually used to convey that you do not intend for that sequence of values to change. It's often used inside programs when you have default settings that you don't want to be modified. If you need an ordered sequence of values that never changes, use a tuple. As tuples do not change, Python implements some optimizations that actually makes tuples slightly faster than using lists. All right, lists. List is going to be a data type that contains multiple values in an ordered sequence. A list value refers to the list value itself, not in the values inside of the list value. So if you call it a list value, we're referring to the things that are inside of it. A list can store any variable or pass like a function like any other value, and values inside of a list are called items. So items are values that can be of any data type. In other words, inside of a list, you can have another list, a string, an integer, dictionary, whatever you want. Items inside of a list are comma separated or comma delimited. You can use the len function in order to calculate the number of the values that are in the list passed to it. So if you want to find out the total number, you can do that. Lists are themselves are mutable, meaning that we can modify them, and lists are started with square brackets. So for example, we have my cat, and then we have fat gray loud here. This would be a list. We have indexes inside of a list, and this is going to refer to that ordered sequence. So the first value in a list is always at index 0. Therefore, if we have this list cat, dog, mouse, spam 0 would return cat out of there. Remember on this list that indexes start at 0. It's another thing that trips people up on the exam. If a list contains other list values, for example, we have this inner list here and this inner list over here. In order to get bat back out of here, we would call spam 0 to get this first index out of here, which is this list. And then we want the 1 index of that inner list. So this spam square bracket 0, square bracket 1 is how we would get bat back out of this. Negative indexes, remember that the last index is always referred to as -1. So if you don't know how many things are inside of it and you want the last one in the list, you can use spam -1 in this case, or -1 in order to get that last value. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay. Slices, these are going to be able to return a single value from a list, which is what an index does. A slice will return several values from a list in the form of a new list. So a slice is 2 integers separated by a colon and square brackets. For example, spam 2 is a list with an index, just 1 integer, where spam 1:4 is going to provide a list with a slice of 2 integers inside of there. All right, so in a slice, you have the first integer, which is where the index starts. Remember that the second integer is where the index is going to end. On a slice, it goes up to, but will not include the value at the second index. In other words, if we have 1,4 up here, we will get everything up to the 4 index, but does not include that 4th index. You can leave out one or both of those indexes on either side of the colon on the slice. So for example, leaving out that and the front part is the same as using 0. Leaving out everything after the colon is the same as saying go to all the way to the end of the list. If you want to change things in a list, you use an assignment statement. So for example, if we have spam equals cat, bat, rat, elephant, if we want to change the first, or not the first index, but the number 1 index, in this case, bat, we want to change that to aardvark, we would say spam 1 inside of here. use the equal sign, which is our assignment statement, and then whatever we want that to. And that will result in a list that looks like this. Just like strings, we have list concatenation and list replication. So you can use the plus operator in order to concatenate two strings together. For example, this one here will result in this end list. If we use replication, it will take whatever's inside of that first list and replicate it twice in that order. When dealing with lists, we have the delete statement, in which case we can delete a specific value at an index. In other words, we need to know what index we want to delete. This will cause all cells to move up one index. So for example, if we have a list dog, cat, horse, we delete spam 1, which is going to remove the cat out of there. We now have spam dog, horse. Spam 1 is now equal to horse from that point on. We commonly use for loops for lists. So when using a for loop with a list, it's common to iterate over the indexes of that list, and they can be used in combination with the range command, and we can use the len function. So for example, if we have a list with ABC in it, if we say for I in the range of the length of some list, notice that this is the first part that's going to get processed, the len of some list, which we will get back what? What's the len of some list? 3, right? So we get back 3, which means we have range of 3 now at this point, which means we are going to go from 0 to 3. So I, the first time around, is going to be 0. Therefore, printing some list, and I'm missing a parenthesis here. This should print A because we're going to pull this index out. Then we're going to pull the second one around because I is going to be equal to 1. We pull this index, and the third time I is equal to 3, therefore, or 2, I'm sorry, and we end up pulling out this index. And this kind of explains exactly how that works when we use a for loop. Real quick, I'm going to try to fix that. Make sure I update that. Okay. Anybody have any questions on the for loops? All right, we talked about the multiple assignment trick several times. This will be on the exam, so pay attention to it. The multiple assignment trick is a shortcut that allows you to assign multiple variables with the values in a list in a single line of code. So for example, if we have cat equals this, note that if we want size to be equal to this one, color equal to this one, and disposition equal to this one, we can shorthand that by typing this in specifically. Note that I specifically wanted these at different places. If these are out of order, I would then have to put them in the proper order down here. It's important. Hint, hint, wink, wink, study this slide. And pay attention when you get to the exam. Don't be in a hurry. Anybody got any questions on multiple assignment trick? Okay. There's quite a few methods with a list. We start with index, in which we can pass it a value. If that value exists, we return the index of that. Append will allow us to add something to the end of a list. Insert requires 2 arguments. We must pass in the index that we want to insert it at and the value that we want to insert. With remove, we can remove whatever value we want. So say we want to remove something that we know in there. It's a lot like delete statement or the del statement. However, with delete, you have to know what the index is. With remove, you know what the value is inside of that list you want to remove. If we use sort by default, reverse is going to be equal to false. If we set that to true, we can reverse the order. The key by default, there is no key, which means it's just going to do it from A to Z by default. Sort's going to use alphabetical order, meaning that it will have uppercase letters come before lowercase letters. If you want to sort by regular alphabetical order, you have to set key equal to str.lower. A list of numbers or strings can be sorted. A combination list of numbers and strings cannot be sorted. In other words, it has to be all integers or it has to be all strings, but it cannot be both. All right, there's going to be a bunch of different examples in here. You can kind of go through those and see what each one of those methods do. There are list-like data types. So lists are not the only data types represented in an ordered sequence. Strings can also be considered a list of single text characters. So for this, that allows you to do indexing, slicing, like we talked about earlier. You can use them in for loops, len loops, etc. Tuples are almost identical to the lists, except tuples are typed with parentheses instead of square brackets, and you cannot modify a tuple. This just reiterates what we talked about on the tuple side. Anybody got any questions on lists? Okay. I know it feels like I'm flying through this stuff, but there's a lot of material in that PowerPoint. But if you have a question, please ask it. Dictionaries, they're going to contain multiple values in an unordered sequence. The index for a dictionary can have many different data types, not just integers like lists use. An index for dictionaries are referred to as keys. And a key and its associated value is referred to as a key value pair or item. A dictionary is typed with curly braces or curly brackets, as you see down here. This would be the example of a dictionary. So we have keys of size, color, and disposition. We have values of fat, gray, and loud. We have items of size fat, color gray, and disposition loud. You can also write those out in this fashion so that it's easy to identify what those key pairs are. In this one, it's not so bad, but if you have a run-on list, it's much easier to do it in this fashion. All right, specific dictionary item, again, is called by its key. So if we have this particular dictionary again, if we want to get size out of it, we just put the size in here as opposed to a list where we would put the index, and we would get back that value that comes out of there. On this one, whoops, give me a second here. Should be a lowercase d. Okay. The keys in this example are going to be the size, color, disposition, and the values are fat, gray, loud. All right. Methods that we have on dictionaries. They will return their own specific data types, and they are immutable, but they can be used in a for loop. So these data types can be passed to the list function if we want to return them and use them as a true list. For example, we can't take what comes out of there and sort it. We would have to convert it to a list, then sort it. So dot keys will get us back all the keys out of the dictionary. Values will get us back all the values, and dot items will return tuples of those dictionary items. And when you use the items in a for loop, you want to use that multiple assignment trick to assign a key value to separate variables, meaning that's typically where you see the k comma v, so that k is all the key, v is equal to the value. But you can also use words that have more meaning than k and v. This would be a lot like in your last homework assignment. We talked about year and name. When we were dealing with the dictionary, you could use the multiple assignment trick to assign those variable names to those. All right. In the get method on a dictionary, we'll retrieve whatever key is there. Otherwise, it will give us back whatever this default is set to. So if this particular thing does not, this key does not exist in the dictionary, it will return whatever value you pass it. By default, it's not going to return anything. Set default is going to do the same thing. It's going to go try to retrieve that key if it exists. However, if it does not exist, we are going to set it to this default value. Again, if we don't pass a default value, it's going to set it to none as a none type variable. If you want to check to see if a key exists or not, you can do this particular dictionary here, in which we have name Sophie, age 7. We can see if name in spam keys, that would give us back true. Sophie in values is going to return whether or not Sophie is a value, which it is. If we say color not in spam keys, right? What's the opposite check there? We can see that that's true. If we try to see if color in spam, notice that if we don't put dot keys or dot values out here, it defaults to dot keys. So if I say color in spam, it's going to check to see whether or not color is in the keys. Anybody got any questions on dictionaries? Okay. Math operators, make sure you know your order of operations, also known as precedence. Anything inside parentheses can override the usual precedence. In other words, it executes what's in parentheses first, then moves its way out. This is the order that you're going to get evaluated in. So know this order so you can make sure that it's going to be done in a particular direction. Comparison operators, these are going to compare two values and always evaluate down to a single true Boolean value of either true or false. An integer or a float point value will always be equal to a string, or be unequal to a string, meaning that if I have 1 in a string equal to 1 as an integer, it will not equal itself. All right. So, for example, this will give you these here. A double equals is equal to, exclamation point equals is not equal to, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, or less than or equal to. Okay. These last ones here only work with integers and floats. You can use any data type in order to check if it's equal to or not equal to. Boolean operators, these are and, or not. It's been a while since we've used those. Make sure you understand those for the midterm. And or will always take two Boolean values and are considered binary operators, where the not operator is just one Boolean value, and it's whatever the opposite of the one that you say. So if it's not true, then it's false. These are your truth tables. You should understand those. Remember, the big difference between a double equal sign is that is equal to, where a single equal sign is an assignment operator. This typically comes in place if you're doing if statements. Some people say if spam equals 2, make sure that you are using a double equal sign and not a single equal sign. If you use a single one, you're assigning spam equal to 2, which is going to return always true. We talked about augmented operators. Instead of having to type out this longhand spam equals spam plus 1, we can say spam plus equals 1. Same thing with the rest of these. You can do the same thing when you try to do list concatenation or list replication or string and string like replication. So you can put these together. You can shorthand it with plus equals. We have in and not in operators. Those are used to determine whether or not a value is or isn't in a particular list. And they are used in conditional expressions, typically requires 2 values. We've talked about this in the if statements, basically. Anybody have any questions with operators? All right, flow control. This is going to be lines of Python code that's grouped together in what's called blocks. If you can tell a block begins or ends from indentation in the lines of code, block rules is that they must always begin when the indentation increases. The block can contain other blocks inside of it, and a block ends when indentation decreases to 0 or whatever it contained above it. So with flow control, we talked about if statements. This is your if, elif, and else, while loops, for loops. We have breaks, which are only used inside of while and for loops. Continues are only used inside of while and for loops. So when we talk about if, elif, and else statements, in an if statement, it requires some condition and is only executed if that value or the Boolean of that expression is true. We require a colon after whatever the condition is, and that the clause must be indented. For the elif portion, it must be used under an if statement, and only if more than one condition is desirable. It must follow that if statement, and it has the same requirements as an if statement up above. On an else, it's used at the end of all if and elif statements. There's no condition on an else statement. Has to have a colon after it. It only gets executed if all the if and elifs are false, and it requires that the clause get indented underneath of it. Note that a else statement is not required in a if and elif sequence. Elif is also not required in the if sequence. Anybody got any questions on if, elif, and else? Okay. While loops. In a while loop, you require some condition. It's only executed if true. You can use break and continue statements in order to get out of that. Remember that a while loop will typically loop indefinitely until that condition evaluates to false or the break keyword is used. And so we use while statements when we're gathering input from people so that we can make sure that they got what we wanted from them. Otherwise, we'll just keep them in an infinite loop until they answer what we wanted. For loops are going to require the for keyword, variable name, in whatever we want to have. A lot of times we'll use a range function, a list, a dictionary, a string, something like that. We can require a colon after the condition, and it has to be indented. We can use for loops and break loops as statements. Inside of a for loop, this will only loop a finite number of times unless the break command is used. So big difference between while and for loop. You can use a while loop to do the same thing as a for loop. However, for loops are more concise. Any questions on looping? Good. All right. We talked about functions early on. Those were like little mini programs within the program. Functions are often used to avoid duplicating code. It's also used to keep your code nice and clean and compartmentalized. It consists of a def statement followed by the colon. After you define whatever the name of it is, can take arguments in between the parentheses. You pass those in. Those are called parameters. Parameters are forgotten when the function returns, and they can return with a return statement, or it would be a default none used. So a return statement allows you to specify exactly what value will be given back. It consists of the following. You have the return and then whatever keyword you want. That value or expression that the function should return. So this keyword could be true, false. It could be whatever variable or number, integer, whatever we want to return. All right, keyword arguments. This is important for some of you to remember. If we have def examples, start, stop, low, and high, make sure you understand that start and stop are required for you to execute example. That you can define low and high, but they must be in the right order. So you want to kind of read through this and make sure you got it right. When we talk about scopes, again, this is going to be extremely important for the midterm. It's one that everybody screws up. On a scope, it's a container for variables. And once that scope is destroyed, all those come out. The big key here is variables that are outside of the function are in the global scope. A variable inside of a local scope is called a local variable. A variable in the global scope is called a global variable. And the variables must be either local or global. Cannot be both. All right. There's only one global scope that starts when the program begins and when the program ends. A local scope is only going to be executed when that function is called. The big one here is the global statement. You can use an outside variable inside your function all you want. However, if you choose to modify that global variable and you want it to stick, then you must use a global statement. I can't just put the word global. I have to say global, whatever the name of the variable is that I want. So if I say my variable is eggs, I must say global eggs in order to bring that in. Anybody have any questions with this? Hint, hint, wink, wink. This is the number one question on the midterm that everybody misses because they don't read. I cannot just use the word global. I have to tell you what variable I'm going to use it with. Any questions on that? Okay. When we're dealing with functions, we have scope rules. So code inside of a global scope cannot use any local variables. A local scope cannot, or it can access global variables, but your code inside of a function's local scope cannot use variables from another local scope. How can you tell if a variable is global or local? It's pretty easy. If the variable is used in the global scope, meaning outside all of the functions, then it's a global variable. If there's a global statement for that variable in a function, it's the global variable. Otherwise, if the variable is used as an assignment statement inside the function, it's considered local. And if that variable is not used in an assignment statement, it's referring back to the global. When we're dealing with functions, errors can be used with try and except statements. Any code that could potentially have an error should be put inside of a try clause. If the code inside of a try clause raises an error, the program begins executing the code wherever the except clause begins. You can accept on specific errors by using the name of that specific error in the except statement, and or you can just use a general except clause that does not match a specific statement. All right. Anybody have any questions on functions? Built-in functions that we talked about during this course. We have the string function, which converts anything to a string, str. We have the int function, which converts anything to an integer, if it can. On the float, we would try to convert anything over to a float, if possible. So string function, it's going to be the most universal because we can pretty much convert anything to a string in terms of converting integers and floating points. We can convert those to strings, but we cannot always do the other way around. Something like this would not work. We talked about the print function. We used it quite a bit. Quotes inside of here are not printed. So if we say print, quote, hello world, then we would print out just hello world. If we just use a blank print statement, it will just print a blank line for us. Does anybody remember why it prints a blank line? There is the end keyword by default, and by default, that's set to a new line character. You can also pass in a separator on the print statement, in which case it would print that character in between the arguments. By default, it's a space. So if we say print this and end that, then we're going to end up with something like this. And there's some examples of using that. We've talked about using the input function that waits for the user to type some kind of characters on the screen, then press enter. This is usually assigned to a variable name, so it can end up being used. So if you use the input function, you typically want to have something like my name equals input. The value from that input function is always a string data type by default. So if they type in 42, note that that is going to be a string, not an integer. You can typically use the print statement in order to print out the prompt before you actually take the input. If you put it in line, then you would use it right inside the input function. Note that you would want to use some kind of space, colon, or hashtag so it presents itself better to the user. In the very beginning, we talked about the len function. Remember that the len function is going to pass in either a string or a list or whatever, and it's going to tell us the total number inside of it. Range function. This is another one you guys will need to remember. In the range function, you have these three parameters that you can pass in this case, arguments. You have the start argument, which will be the starting number. Stop is going to be everything that is included up to but does not include. The step argument is going to be the variable that's increased. So if we have 1 to 10, we're going to give all numbers from 1 through 9. If step is equal to 1 by default, it's going to give us 1 through 9. If we have 2 in there, we're going to get 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Everybody understand the range function? I know it seems simple. Somebody's going to forget it on the midterm. You can use a type function to determine what type of data type that a value is. List function, this is how you can convert something over to a list. Make sure that if you have something like this, that you explain how this list function works. Once again, on the midterm, everybody screws it up. They don't pay attention. So understand how a list function works. No different than a tuple function. You pass it in a list or you pass it in a string, you get what back out of it. All right, the last thing that we covered was regular expressions. This allows you to specify a pattern of text that you're going to search for. In a pattern expression matching, you have to import the regex module with import RE. You're going to create a regex object with re.compile, passing in a raw string of whatever it is, the pattern that you're looking for. You pass the string that you want to search into using the .search method. This will return a match object. We call that match object's group method in order to return a string of actual match text. We talked about grouping and how you would do that with this raw string. This was the example of a phone number. You can also use a pipe, in which case you can match one of many expressions. Only the first one found will be returned. Find all. In search, you only get one thing back. In find all, you're going to get every instance of that back, usually as a list of all those strings that are matched. If you did not use grouping, it's just one thing. If you did use grouping, you're going to get back a grouping of tuples inside of that list. We use the substitute method. This is going to be able to allow you to substitute text in place of something. Think of it as find and replace inside of Microsoft Word. You could use sub A, B. A is going to be the first argument, which is the string that you want to replace. B is going to be where you're placing it in the string. So A is what you're replacing it with. B is what the actual string is that you want to search through and replace it. If you have complex regexes, for example, this really long one here, you would want to use triple quotes down here so that you can break that out in a nice clean line. And then you would also need to pass in re.verbose so it knows that this is actually compiled to look like this one. Remember these standard common character classes. Lowercase d is going to be any numeric digit from 0 to 9. Capital D is anything not 0 from 9. You have /w and /s as well. If you want to create your own classes, you use brackets. And those square brackets, you can use a caret inside of there to match characters that are not inside that character class. These are all the different regex symbols that you would use in order to match based on certain things. I'll let you guys review these tables. All right, when we deal with import statements and you bring in additional functions, I'm going to wrap this up real quick. Python has a set of built-in modules in a standard library. You have to use the import keyword, then the name of the module. Optionally, for more modules, you can use comma-separated values for that. Remember that it's best practice to put each import on its own line. To import something where you just import a single function out of that module, you would say from whatever module name, import that function. We talked about the random module. You would import that in. We use the randint function in order to return a random integer. Note that on random int, you're going to start up here and you're going to stop on this number. It does include that last number, different than the range and all the other ones we used. Sys module, the main thing that we talked about with it is using sys.exit. This will immediately terminate or execute your program. We talked about the copy module. Copy.copy is going to allow us to copy a list or a dictionary. Remember that if you have lists inside of list, it's better to use copy.decopy. We talked about pretty print. This is used to usually print out dictionaries in an easier fashion, especially if they have nested lists or dictionaries inside of it. Import pretty print. Prettyprint.prettyprint will print that out. You could also use the P format, which returns a string, and then you can print that out. Paperclip, this is how we use copy and paste off a system's clipboard. RE module is for us to bring in regex and to compile those out. We talked a little bit about references and moving those in. This comes back to passing them in. You can read that. Comments real quick. Hashtags are for single lines. Multi-lines are going to use triple quotes. And that's it.